My sermon this morning is inspired by the person who won the right to name the sermon in last year's auction. When I asked them what they would like me to preach about, the answer was both simple and capacious: self-help. I responded with a desire for a little bit more specificity. What about self-help? The assignment came back. I read a lot of self-help books. I enjoy the genre. I'd like you to pick a few self-help books on anything you like and preach a sermon on the topic of self-help. Self-help. Previously, I've not read a great number of books that fall under this genre. The closest I've come to anything approaching a regular basis is my encounters with how-to books. Last year, the staff and I read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, and I have a small and growing pile of texts on how to preach a sermon or how to serve a church. In general, though, I don't spend a lot of time on the genre of self-help. The first thing I did when considering the preaching assignment was to visit a local bookshop with a large selection of self-help books to get a better sense of the genre. The store I picked has recast self-help as personal growth, and I spent about 2 hours there looking through the several hundred titles on offer. It was an overwhelming experience. There were plenty of classics, titles like Chicken Soup for the Soul, How to Make Friends and Influence People, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, the Japanese art of decluttering and organizing. There were even a larger number of books on subjects that I had never even thought about or heard of before. Apparently, there's an entire subgenre devoted to something called forest bathing. This appears to be the Japanese practice of immersing yourself in nature in a mindful way to overcome the hectic pace of contemporary life. Self-help. One of the conceits of the genre is that the author claims that they're going to teach you something that you want to learn. Their teaching is either going to lead you to a higher level of functionality. Read this book and you'll be able to master your personal finances, or a deeper understanding of yourself and greater sense of personal fulfillment or happiness. In line with the genre's format, I want to share a little bit of my own sermon writing practices. Compared with preaching in the Christian or Jewish traditions, Unitarian Universalist ministers have a great deal of latitude when it comes to selecting our sermon topics. In many other traditions, preachers have to organize their thoughts in order to respond to a particular set of scriptural texts. If we were Episcopalians, today I would offer you a sermon that in some way related to the day's passages from the Hebrew Bible, Psalter, Christian New Testament, or Gospels. If our congregation followed Jewish practice, I would have responded to a Torah portion or a Haftorah portion today. Most books on homiletics, which is really the self-help art of religious rhetoric for preachers, revolve around the assumption that the preacher will organize their teaching in such a way. The process they recommend for sermon composition is usually the same. Narrow in on a passage from the selection of texts available. Ask a question of it, like, what did this text mean to the people who wrote it? Do some research into the background. And then ask another question, such as, what does this text mean for us today? Sitting in the background is always the operative assumption that a text written 2,000 to 3,000 years ago for a community of peoples whose life experiences was vastly different than our own has some meaning for us today. Nonetheless, the injunction is then to sit, meditate, contemplate the text, let the Spirit move you, brainstorm a little, and then go preach your sermon. The advice varies a great deal depending on the preacher who's providing it, but I hope you get the gist. The book advises you to begin with the text and then go from there. Unitarian Universalism has a somewhat different tact. My own method is to pick a topic, and how I do that is a lengthy subject in its own right, and then try to find some boundaries to orient myself around. The selection of boundaries is always important. Without them, I'm prone to wander off the map and find myself beyond the edge where, as the medievalists would have it, there be dragons. Self-help. Looking at the great swath of books available to me in the bookstore, I realized I needed to construct some boundaries for myself if I was going to have any hope on narrowing in on something to give you a meaningful message. Today is the last Sunday of Black History Month. My two previous sermons for the month revolved around black male religious leaders, Malcolm X and Howard Thurman, so I figured I should pick some books that centered black women. Equipped with this single criteria, I then began to make my way through the bookshelves. It was a rather dispiriting experience. According to their headshots, the average writer of a self-help or personal growth text appears to have a particular profile. Their photographs reveal them to largely be fit, middle-aged, white, and successful. Description, I suppose, that could apply to me. One of the joys of literature is that it offers us the opportunity to experience the world from someone else's perspective. The writer Donald Murray once argued that all writing is autobiographical. And there's a sense that any text is an effort on the part of the author to share something that is important. Otherwise, writers would not write what they write. There's been studies that show that reading improves our ability to be empathic. Readers are invited by writers to imagine the world from their perspective. When I read a book, I might be transported back in time, across the planet, or invited to experience the place I live from a different perspective. The self-help genre appears to take this approach when it comes to the ordinary problems so many of us face. Struggles with money, relationship, love, parenting, the search for happiness, fulfillment, and self-help. The writer seems to be stating, here's this thing I've been struggling with. I figured out some things about it, and I'd like to share with you what I've learned. Kyra Jewel Lingo says as much in the introduction to her book, We Were Made for These Times. A former Buddhist nun and a student of Thich Nhat Hanh, she promises early in her text, in this book, we'll learn ways of finding freedom and stability in the midst of all of this. The other two self-help books I picked from the bookshop, the comedian Lonnie Love's I Tried to Change So You Don't Have to, True Life Lessons, and Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, each contained similar passages. Self-help. The name of the genre implies a sort of radical individualism. The focus is on improving the self, not society. And the responsibility for making this improvement is yours. Works of fiction tend to be written in the first or third person. Scholarly tomes and newspaper articles often attempt an impersonal, seemingly objective tone. Good prose is like a window pane, claimed George Orwell, that master of journalism, in one of his many essays that could be likened to a self-help text for writers. A successful work of reportage, he reasoned, needed to include the effacement of one's own personality. Not so with self-help. In that genre, the writer is always sharing their own experience and addressing you directly. The message of my story is simple. If you're struggling to change because you think it might bring you love, success, and happiness, It's time to start thinking another way, advises Lonnie Love before concluding. Instead of trying to change, you'd be better off focusing on loving yourself. Believe me, after years of struggling, I've come to see the truth. Sometimes we don't need to fix our flaws to get ahead and get happy. I've come to the truth. It's a phrase that encapsulates much of the genre's spirit. Here's something that I've learned. I want to share it with you. It's been useful to me. I imagine it will be useful to you. The implication in all of this is that we, you and I, are largely masters of our own destiny. Lonnie Love's self-help manual revolves around her story of economic transcendence. She was born to a single mother who lived in public housing in Detroit. Her family was poor. Their neighborhood was dangerous. One of her closest friends in high school was killed in a drive-by shooting. And she had few opportunities as a child. Yet she managed to rise above it all, discovering the key to success is knowing what you want, then figuring out how to get it without having to change who you are. It is a powerful message coming from a black woman who built a successful career in the overwhelmingly white world of Hollywood. By embracing herself, her talents, by not trying to become someone else, she was able to become authentically herself. Her experience and her self-help book are a testament to what happens when people are able to celebrate their own inherent worth and dignity. And that, at its core, seems to be the gift of the genre. In their offerings, many self-help authors appear to share a message like, "This is how I learned how to embrace my own inherent worth and dignity. Let me share a bit of my wisdom with you." And yet, there's something about the radical individualism of the genre that bothers me. It might be because I'm a preacher by vocation rather than a self-help author. There is a tension between the two occupations. The philosopher Charles Taylor has argued that one of the features of our so-called secular age is that the therapeutic has replaced the religious. Rather than understanding our imperfections as manifestations of some larger cosmic evil, he argues, we've come to understand feelings of impotence, division, anguish, spleen, melancholy, emptiness, incapacity, paralyzing gloom as symptoms of treatable illnesses. Self-help books are frequently oriented towards empowering the individual to engage in the work of healing themselves from whatever sickness or imagined inadequacy they suffer. The manuals on finances I glanced at mostly seem to focus on the personal work of drawing up household budgets and making wise investment choices. Rarely did they suggest that a focus on public policy was an effective strategy to eliminate poverty. Frequently, they seem to be absent any sort of social critique. Here there is a confluence between some of the most popular contemporary preaching and the self-help genre. Superstar preachers like Rick Warren and Joel Osteen offer messages of self-improvement in their sermons. Trust in God's plan for you, they tell us, and you will find prosperity, love, and joy. My own message, and the message of Unitarian Universalism, is somewhat different. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about us. We come together in community to help each other. We recognize that the search for truth is not a solitary project. It's something best engaged in together. We believe that the project is building the beloved community is not my work or your work alone. It's our work. Liberation is not a solitary endeavor. The overcoming of an individual illness, it is our great collective project. That does not mean that there's no room for self-improvement or personal growth here at the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston. The pursuit of personal growth, the celebration of your inherent worth and dignity, the uncovering of the truth, spiritual and otherwise, is one of the primary reasons why we come together. But we are here, you and I, because we suspect that such work is best done within the confines of community. 19th century Unitarians believed this as well. In his famous essay on the subject of self-culture, William Ellery Channing claimed, "Self-culture is social. The work of seeing our faculties grow," he believed, "consists of raising above what is narrow, particular, individual, selfish, to the universal and unconfined. It was evident that when we nurture the affections which spring up instinctively in the human heart, and discover ourselves bound up together as romantic partners, parent and child, siblings, friends and neighbors, and citizens. It comes when we realize, in the famous words of Martin Luther King Jr., whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be." The two other books I brought home from the personal growth section offered something approximating this message. Adrienne Marie Brown is a Detroit-based community organizer and healer. She specializes in women's health as a doula, who seeks the work of collaboration and personal growth as inextricably intertwined. Looking at the devastation that surrounds us, she observes, "The crisis everywhere is massive, massive, massive. We are small." And yet, she finds hopes in the ways in which we can cultivate within ourselves and our communities new patterns of being. She writes that hope is to be found in the way that small actions and connections create complex systems. Drawing inspiration from her ecological studies, she observes individual deeds can become patterns, become ecosystems and societies. Her message is that our strategy for building the beloved community is found in the ways that we grow our capacity to embody the just and liberated worlds we long for. That growth takes place within the context of community. It is not just individual work, it is individual and community work. Self-help. Korea Jewel Lingo's insights are similar. In these times, she believes that the project of growing into our best selves is most present in the struggles to confront the climate crisis, overcome white supremacy, tackle economic inequality, and rejuvenate democracy. Her work is to link Buddhist practice with the collective project of liberation. We can only get free together. Looking soberly at the challenges that beset us, she creates meditations centered on the simple premise: you were made for these times, to meet this moment as it is, whatever it brings. And then she invites us into a practice of self-discovery where we recognize that the individual challenges we face are also collective ones. The individual challenges we face are also collective ones. It seems necessary to close the sermon on self-help with a comment on the crisis of the hour, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. In the international sphere, it might even be cast as a crisis of radical individualism or self-help. Russia has been able to invade the Ukraine because the Ukrainian government is not party to NATO or the European Union. Absent formal military treaties, the United States government and members of countries of NATO have been unwilling to send military troops to bolster the Ukrainian borders. Now, this, of course, is a gross oversimplification of the situation, but the broad outlines of the conflict are nonetheless instructive. An authoritarian despot has organized the military he controls to invade a country governed by a president who has been democratically elected. The issue animating the conflict seems to be whether or not the Ukraine will have self-determination as a nation? Will it be able to follow its own path of self-help and development? Will its citizens be able to join the European Union, as the majority of them want to? Or will they be consigned to the thrall of a present-day totalitarian dictator? The question will likely be resolved not only upon the actions of the Ukrainian peoples, on their ability to help themselves, but through the actions of the larger international powers like Germany and the United States. Now, I don't pretend to know precisely what policy lines the government of this country or the governments of the European countries should be following. But what I do know is this: the violent takeover of one country by another is an assault on the larger democratic project. And it reveals the truth that our destinies, our abilities to grow as individuals, as peoples, and as countries are profoundly interconnected. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. May we remember these words and, in helping ourselves, recognize that our liberations are all bound up together. Amen, Ashe, and blessed be.